Welcome to the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Jackson. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, and each episode I cast a critical eye over current maternity care practice by grappling with research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. To get access to all the research that I use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. Welcome to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. This is episode 100, and nearly 2 years of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. We've surpassed 850,000 downloads, and in the next few months we'll reach 1 million. This is an independent podcast. We don't have professional representation or management, so we wouldn't have made it to episode 100 without you, the people who listen to this podcast. This is truly grassroots activity and completely reliant upon our listeners. So thank you to all the loyal listeners who have been here from the beginning. There is a unique cohort of people who have listened to every single episode of the Great Birth Rebellion and who stuck with the podcast through the significant changes that occurred from episode 75 onwards. I'd love to take this opportunity to also acknowledge Bea from Core and Flora Store, my co-host for the first 75 episodes, and her contribution to the early success of the Great Birth Rebellion. If you love this podcast and want to see it keep going to 200 episodes and beyond, there are 2 ways you can help. They'll cost you nothing. Firstly, subscribe to the podcast on whichever podcast platform you listen to it from. And leave us a 5-star rating, and if you really love it, consider leaving a review. Everyone loves some positive feedback to keep them going, and your review helps other people to start listening and learning to the podcast too. That said, let's get started with today's episode. Today is our 3rd and final contribution to the topic of gestational diabetes. In episode 98, we covered gestational diabetes screening. In 99, we were privileged to have Lily Nichols cover real food for gestational diabetes. And today, we're talking about the use of movement for the maintenance of blood sugar levels during pregnancy. It's for anyone, but with special consideration to women who are putting extra efforts to managing their blood sugar in pregnancy. There are 2 types of research on the topic of using movement and exercise to control blood sugar levels for women who have gestational diabetes. There is research that covers if and how exercise or movement can lower blood sugar levels. And then there's research about the outcomes of using exercise to control blood sugar levels. And this looks at the long-term impact of having used movement and exercise in your pregnancy. These may look the same thing, but they're not. So today I'm talking about if and how movement and exercise has the ability to help women control their blood sugar levels in pregnancy, and give some really practical tips on how you can apply what you've learnt today to controlling your own blood sugar levels if that's what you're trying to do through your pregnancy. What I won't be talking about today is the pregnancy outcomes associated with this. So what I mean is there's a lot of research that, for example, asks pregnant women to apply an exercise regime to their self-care practices, and then they do research to see if it changed certain outcomes for their pregnancy. Did it affect the birth weight of the babies? Does it change the number of women who need cesarean sections? Does it impact upon induction rates or the speed of labour progress? That's what I mean by outcomes. So today I'll be looking at how to use movement or exercise to help manage your blood sugar levels in pregnancy, but I'm not commenting on the research about how this kind of movement will or won't impact on overall outcomes of pregnancy and birth. If you have gestational diabetes and can effectively manage your blood sugar levels to keep them within normal limits using diet and movement, then your body is completely unaware that you've been diagnosed with gestational diabetes, which means you've effectively mitigated the risks of gestational diabetes, and you or your baby won't have the side effects that can occur from unmanaged or poorly controlled gestational diabetes. If you can see that your blood sugar has been controlled, you can confidently avoid all the interventions that women are offered at birth if they have gestational diabetes, if that's what you want. So in the last episode, Lily spoke to us about how to control your blood sugar using food. and today I'll be sharing how to control your blood sugar using movement. So straight up, I want to say that the research on the topic of exercise and movement for gestational diabetes management is varied and uncertain. This was a really tricky one to know what to say here, because we know that movement has benefits for the human body. There's no doubt about that. But what there is doubt about is how much movement is required to impact on blood sugar levels of women with gestational diabetes. What we do know is that exercise and movement have the ability to make your body soak up excess blood sugar that's flowing around your body and suck it into the working muscles of your body, independent of insulin. So Lily told us in the last episode that gestational diabetes is the result of a state of pregnancy-induced insulin resistance. And when your body is resistant to the action of insulin, that means that your body has trouble soaking up and using the sugar that's in your blood from the food that you've eaten. So then the more and more sugar that builds up in your bloodstream with nowhere to go, then it creates a circumstance where when you measure your blood sugar levels, it's high. So normally insulin would unlock your body cells in your muscles and in your tissues and help move the sugar from your bloodstream into your body cells, and then your body cells use it for energy. But instead, the sugar gets stuck in your bloodstream. And what we know from exercise science is that circumstances where the activity of insulin is inhibited, such as in insulin resistance and gestational diabetes, that exercise and movement and the use of your muscles makes your body cells open up. They open themselves up. I mean, there's a more complex mechanism than that, but they open themselves up and they take sugar into the body cell independent of insulin. So by exercising, you can force your body to do the work of insulin, even though you have insulin resistance. And this theoretically reduces blood sugar levels. Now, there are scientific explanations for exactly how this happens, and if that's what you need to know, the exact mechanisms, how this works, please go ahead, sign up to the mailing list for this podcast, because those papers are in the resource folder for this episode. The mechanisms behind impaired insulin sensitivity during gestational diabetes are not completely well understood, but it's thought that exercise may be an effective strategy to optimize glucose balance and stability, as it can lower blood glucose levels. And also, if you do it habitually, it allows your body not to work so hard in creating high levels of insulin, because your body knows that it can rely on movement as a way of reducing your blood sugar level if it's habitual. And exercise lowers blood glucose concentration via two distinct mechanisms called the contraction-mediated pathway and the insulin-stimulated pathway. Again, if these things are of interest to you, go ahead and look at the resources in the resource folder if you're on the mailing list. But the physiological mechanism involves things such as insulin-sensitive glucose transporters like GLUT4, and exercise can enhance the response of GLUT4. And this works in combination with your body's usual functions to lower glucose concentration in your blood. And the reason that exercise can also help is that skeletal muscles, so all the muscles that move your body when you move, are a major source of insulin-stimulated glucose uptake. So any treatment targeted to improve glucose uptake into your tissues, into your muscles, any part that moves while you're exercising, then it improves the whole body's insulin sensitivity. So if gestational diabetes is a state of insulin resistance, and exercise creates a circumstance where your body becomes insulin sensitive, then you're actually potentially reversing the mechanism that occurs when you get gestational diabetes. So this is what the research agrees on, that exercise has the capacity to help with blood sugar management by the way of the mechanisms that I briefly mentioned, with your muscles effectively soaking up blood glucose. But where the research differs and where there's no consistent agreement or research is the question of how much exercise and what type of exercise or movement is needed to help women effectively use exercise and movement to help control their blood glucose levels. Also, exercise independently without any other changes is unlikely to do the trick. It's just a tool that can be added to the strategies that you will apply when you're trying to manage gestational diabetes. So this would be done in conjunction with blood glucose monitoring, diet control, and if those strategies don't work, it might be time to consider medical management with medications. So here is my educated opinion on this, based on what I've read over the years and what I understand about body physiology and what I've seen work for my own clients. If you have gestational diabetes, there's no doubt that exercise and movement should be a part of your management routine. If you do it within your own personal capacity and are checking in with your body and that it's okay, then there are only benefits and no harms to introducing exercise and movement into your daily routine. With regards to the amount and type of movement, the research indicates that while a small amount is still healthful, it's not enough to make a clinical or lasting impact upon blood sugar levels throughout pregnancy. The minimum amount of time that I came across in the research appeared to be around 90 minutes of exercise, with a sliding scale where the more you move and the more you exercise, the more likely and the better the impact was on your blood sugar levels. Some studies made a distinction between aerobic exercise that really gets your heart rate up, things like running and cycling, and those ones that really get your heart pumping. And then they also compared things like resistance training with weights or Pilates or yoga, those exercises that required some kind of weight bearing. Both were beneficial but acted slightly differently to create change to your blood glucose levels. Get creative about what exercises and movement would be meaningful for you. Exercise doesn't mean that you have to get active wear and sensible walking sneakers and street walk for 90 to 120 minutes per day. You can do that if you like and listen to the Great Birth Rebellion while you're at it. Take your dog or get a dog. Take your children and family if you've got them. This is all fine, but consider other ways of moving. I had a client with definite, undeniable gestational diabetes. It was not a fault in the screening process. It was clear, a very clear case of gestational diabetes. She had the highest blood glucose levels I'd ever seen personally for any of my clients, and I let her know that if she was unable to control her own blood glucose levels with diet and movement changes, then we might need to consider a change in plan for her pregnancy and birth care. Her and her partner were so motivated to get her blood sugar levels under control that they followed my dietary education, which included a lot of the suggestions that Lily Nichols made in the last episode on real food for gestational diabetes. I also suggested that she return to the traditional dietary practices of her heritage. So she was a woman of Asian heritage, and I encouraged her to adopt a diet that would be more traditional for her body type. I encouraged regular wake and sleep patterns with the interest of not staying up too late in the evenings past 10 p.m. and waking early to have a full day with the sun. And we know that regular sleep-wake patterns impact upon blood sugar regulation. So I encouraged this for her. I also suggested eating at regular meal times so that her body had a clock to know when it needed to release the most amount of insulin. And then finally, I suggested movement after every meal, or just whatever she could manage. The exercise and movement part was easy during the daylight hours for her, but at night after dinner there was some difficulty just because it was cold and dark. And so to remedy this, she decided to turn on some music and dance each evening after dinner. She worked up a sweat, she released some stress, and she had fun. And she did some tests and noticed that in the evenings that she didn't dance, her nighttime sugars were higher. And when she did dance, she could bring high post-meal blood glucose readings down within normal limits pretty quickly. So she just found something that worked for her. So that's what I suggest for anyone who's considering exercise and movement for the management of gestational diabetes. Find something that works for you, test it out along with your blood glucose monitor to see if it's been effective. And so Lily suggested in the episode she did with us on real food for gestational diabetes that a standard for blood sugar control using diet was to eat to the blood glucose monitor, meaning make changes based on what you know for yourself and your own body. You might need to make significant dietary changes in order to keep your blood glucose stable and within range, or you might only need to make minor tweaks. And it's the same with exercise. You might find that light levels of exercise do the trick. Try and time your exercise and movement for after a meal or at different times of the day to see which makes the most difference to your blood glucose levels. You might find that you need a lot of exercise, more than 120 minutes a day to keep your blood glucose levels stable. So in regards to how much movement and what type you need to do to adequately manage your own blood glucose levels using movement, I would suggest the same approach as with dietary management. Just see how much your body needs to make a difference to your blood glucose levels. Test it out a bit with the different exercise and movement options. Start with ones that are easy and within your reach and move on from there until you find a style, an intensity, and an amount that suits your personal needs. Everybody's different. And I believe that's why there's no consensus on what works best for gestational diabetes. So it's okay to take an individual approach and use your blood glucose readings as your guide to how much and what type and what time of the day you need to do exercise and movement. Do as much or as little as you need to make a difference, because at the end of the day, gestational diabetes management is all about applying strategies that will effectively keep your blood glucose levels within normal range. You can start this right away, right after this episode. Find some joyful music, grab a warm body or something else with a heartbeat, and dance around the house for 30 minutes. You'll feel so good afterwards. Movement is good for your body, and it might just do the trick to get your blood glucose levels under control. Take home message: exercise to the blood glucose monitor. Similar to what Lily spoke about with eating to the blood glucose monitor. With regards to applying a personalized exercise or movement strategy to your circumstance, it's all about testing out what works and committing to that. I am wishing you all the best with your gestational diabetes journey. You've got this. To get free access to all the research that's used to create each podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or you can join our members hub and financially support the work of this podcast. In the hub, you can ask me questions, and premium members get access to a monthly Q&A episode where I answer listener questions. You'll also get episode transcripts and additional resources for each podcast episode. All the details are in the show notes.